Hello and welcome to this London Symphony Orchestra live stream, live from the Barbican Centre in London. My name is Rachel Leach and I'm going to be with you in the next 20 minutes or so in the run-up to tonight's concert, which will be streamed live. And we've got three Russian composers tonight. We've got Rachmaninov's second piano concerto, Balakirev's Islamey, and then Shostakovich's first symphony. And the man behind the decisions is tonight's conductor, Maestro Noseda. Here he is. So why did you choose these three works?
Because I have a strong connection with Russia, because I spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg at the Mariinsky Theater, and because I love the three pieces, and also because the Balakirev piece, Islamey, is a piano piece written by Balakirev, and the orchestration is made by Casella, Alfredo Casella, Italian composer. So it's a combination of Russian-Italian.
I think it's going to be the first time many people have heard this piece tonight. I think it's great that we're bringing this to a new audience. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. It's very famous in the piano world because it's one of the most difficult virtuoso pieces ever written. So if you needed to be not only a great pianist, a super virtuoso to play that. But the orchestral version, I have to say, is not less virtuoso, less difficult. So requires the skills of all the artists of the LSO or the great orchestra to make it work. It's a fantastic sort of showpiece, very flamboyant, very full of good spirit. In a way, reminds this kind of fairy, market fairy in Russia, so like Petrushka, something like that.
And this begins the second half, doesn't it? The first half we have Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto.
This is true, yeah.
So very famous work, that second piano concerto. How do you put your own stamp on a piece that's that famous?
I think the best thing I can do is just to keep it simple. Sometimes when something is very famous, very familiar, the risk is to overdo, to over-egg all the stories, just to put too much marsala in the zabayon. It's fantastic the first spoon, by the second already you are not. So just to keep it simple, and sometimes going back to the score and working with this fantastic soloist, Seong-Jin Cho, really one of the greatest today, even if he's so young. It's fantastic because everything becomes natural, organic, not artificial. I'm not saying the other interpretations are artificial, but it's very natural the way we try to present to the audience tonight.
You're a real champion of this soloist, aren't you? You're a real fan of his. How have you been working with him over the last few days?
I love him, and of course he's one of the Chopin Warsaw competition, but we started already a couple of years ago to work together. We made a recording of the Chopin first piano concerto with the London Symphony, and last summer we had a very long tour, a European tour with the European Union Youth Orchestra. He was the soloist. He played the second Chopin piano concerto, and what is special about Seong-Jin is this kind of natural way of approaching any music. In a way, sounds new, because it's so fresh. And we will have in 2 weeks' time another occasion in Washington, D.C., where I'm music director of the National Symphony Orchestra, to play together Ravel piano concerto. So it's a sort of relationship that we like to keep alive.
Yeah. And finally, Shostakovich's first symphony, written when he was just 18. I mean, how does it compare with his later works?
I think you are right, because you made just the average. He started when he was 17, even earlier. So he was a teenager. He finishes the symphony while he was 19. Can you imagine such a mature piece composed by a teenager? Of course, there is the risk to put too many musical ideas, like all the youngsters they want to do. They want to make an impression. But there are also moments of this kind of sadness and this kind of dark feeling, which is typical of the late Shostakovich works. So the combination of joyful element, sarcasm, cynicism, ironic feeling, and maturity, and also in the third movement, which is so chromatic, so meant to be difficult to listen, through the chromatism, which is not an easy way to do, he makes one of the most espressivo movements ever. So it's a sign of genius, this first symphony.
And this will be part of your cycle of Shostakovich?
Correct. We are recording all the symphonies with the London Symphony for LSO Life, and it's fantastic because any symphony we approach, we bring behind our shoulders the experience of the other symphonies, and to approach the number one after having done 5, 8, 4 and 10 gives us even more knowledge, we have some more thing in our pocket to bring out.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
It's fantastic.
Have a great concert.
Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. So earlier today, we caught up with Stephen Johnson, who has written a book about Shostakovich and how Shostakovich has really saved him during some of his darkest times. So here's that short film right now. Stephen, you've written a book called How Shostakovich Changed My Mind. So how did Shostakovich change your mind?
Oh, that's quite a big question. I mean, for years I've been tormented, I suppose, in a way, or perplexed by this question of why I like dark music so much. Even when I was a kid, I used to love symphonies in minor keys. And that naturally gravitates you towards Russian composers. I remember Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninov, and later Shostakovich were big on the list. Lots of minor key symphonies, fantastic. But actually, with time, I began to realize that there were certain kinds of dark music that seemed to be important. I felt, you know, this isn't depressing. It may take you to dark places, but it's not actually lowering your spirits. In fact, some strange way, it's quite the reverse. And then I started going to Russia, and I met people, I still can't quite believe this, but I met people who lived through the Stalinist eras. You know, some of them remembered the 30s and the period they call Stalin's terror. And one of them had been at the first performance of Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, which was a sensational success, even though at the time there was this thing called socialist realism, which said that basically all art must be affirmative, it must affirm the ultimate rightness of reality, reality being Stalin's communist utopia. Therefore, you know, the more major keys you could think of, the better. And Shostakovich writes this dark, largely tragic symphony with a seemingly optimistic ending. And it's a huge success. I remember meeting a man, he was about 93, and this would have been 10 years ago, who was at that performance. And he said, "You've no idea what it's like. You're living in hell, and all around art is grinning inanely and telling you that this is heaven. And suddenly you hear music that says to you, it is as bad as you think. And suddenly you want to cry with joy because you're not alone, someone's heard you, but also something else." And it was another man I met who he said, "There's something about hearing your most painful emotions transformed into something beautiful." He didn't have to say any more. I could actually feel the hairs on my neck prickling again as I say this, because that was a light going on moment. There is. And this goes right back to why the ancient Greeks thought that tragedy was not only an important thing for human beings to experience on the stage, but also that it had some sort of unifying effect, that it brought people together. And Stalinism was very, very good at making people feel alone. And Shostakovich's music was very, very good at making them feel that they weren't. And a friend of mine said to me, "It's funny, isn't it, because you get an awful lot of composers who talk about very dark and painful stuff, and you feel they're talking about I, but so often with Shostakovich, he seems to talk about we." And that's not just some vague thing. You look at the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony, and you have these very lost and lonely and plaintive woodwind solos. But they're answered every time, almost like in a religious service, by deep chant-like figures on the bass, or then a passage that could almost be a Russian Orthodox choir singing. And I think in those moments you can hear the one lonely voice and then the voice of the many responding to each other. And that there was a period, particularly in my middle teens, when I think music was the only thing that actually helped me keep going, and that Shostakovich was particularly important. And his music became a kind of safe space in which it was possible to explore these emotions, discharge them, as it were. Because after all, music has a beginning and a middle and an end, particularly music like Shostakovich's. It's tonal, so it's got resolution. And you know how long the piece will last. You know you don't have to be with it forever. You can switch it off, or you can leave the room, or whatever. So you're, to a certain extent, you're in control. And one thing I found, because there's quite a bit about neurology in the book, which astounded me, was there's a hormone called oxytocin, which is what mothers and babies release when they're breastfeeding, and it creates the very, very close bond that there is there. And the experience of listening to music, particularly if it's very intense emotional music, can also stimulate the production of oxytocin. So you could almost feel as though, well, that there is an element of love in this, and not just of you loving the music, but of almost being loved in return. And even if it's an illusion, it's a very, very important and valuable one. Well, I feel I know an enormous amount to this man, really, to his extraordinary music. What I think this book is about, in a way, well, I remember reading this passage years and years ago and thinking, one day I've got to write a book about this, and forgot that. And then years later it occurred to me that this was it, after I'd started it. And it's a passage from Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, which again you think is a pretty grim, lightless story. But there is a moment, Gregor, it's not far from the end. He's not going to be transformed back from this horrible insect. His family are deserting him, as it were. And he hears the sound of a violin played by his sister. And yet his sister played so beautifully. Her face was turned to the side, intently and sadly following the notes on the page. Gregor crept a little further, keeping his head near the ground so that his eyes could meet hers. How could he be a brute beast if music could make him feel like this? And that, I think, is what the question was ultimately, that I probably, as a teenager, found myself asking when I sort of pounded my way across the West Pennine Moors with the tragic Fourth Symphony in my head, was this music is so desperately unhappy, and yet I feel exultant in the midst of it. And why? Well, it's how could I be an insect if music could make me feel like this? And that, I think, is the kind of the digest of where it is that music meets us in our worst feelings, and what it is it does for us. It's redemptive, I think, is the word.
I'm joined by writer and broadcaster David Neese now, who's an expert on all things classical music, and particularly for us tonight, the Russians. So what are the connections between these three composers?
Well, it's interesting that Shostakovich, of course, we think of very much as the 20th century composer, and the others as belonging to the end of the 19th century. One of the interesting connections, I suppose, is that Shostakovich and Rachmaninov both started very young. As I think you've already heard from Gianandrea Noseda, that the First Symphony was written as a student exercise. And if we go back to Rachmaninov, he also wrote this wonderful one-act opera based on Pushkin's The Gypsies called Alyeko for his student graduation exercise. And that was a great success and was hugely admired by Tchaikovsky. Just before he died, he managed to give his stamp of approval to the young Rachmaninov. So we've got that link for a start.
And so Balakirev, in the middle of this, creates this thing called the Five. And what were his thoughts behind getting these composers around him?
He wanted a truly Russian school of music. I mean, I think there's been a slight over-concentration in the history books on the Five, which actually only existed as a movement for a very short period of time. I mean, again, another composer, Rimsky-Korsakov, was 17 years old when he came into the circle and started working on his First Symphony under the guidance of Balakirev, who actually wasn't a lot older. He was only in his mid-20s. And, of course, the interest there is that he had started a First Symphony, but he took 30 years to write it. So big difference between him and the other two, in a sense.
What is it about these Russians all starting very early?
That's a very interesting question. I can't answer it, but I mean, we should throw another one into the mix. Glazunov, who wrote his First Symphony when he was 16. And again, it's almost as good as the others. So I don't know why. I mean, you've got Schubert and Mendelssohn, they're both teenage geniuses, but there aren't that many others. But the Russians do tend to sort of lead the way.
But Glazunov, I'm glad you mentioned him, because he's a bit of a dark figure in tonight's concert, because he is responsible for Rachmaninoff's disastrous First Symphony, right?
First performance that he conducted, yes.
Why did that go so badly wrong? Do you know?
Well, I mean, legend has developed the idea that he was drunk. I suspect he was just not very well prepared, or the orchestra wasn't very well prepared. It's a tragedy that that First Symphony was very nearly lost forever. Rachmaninoff was so upset that he wanted it destroyed. And of course, it was only after his death that a copy was found. And we know that it is as great as the other two, if not greater, in an authentic, raw sense.
But also, kind of luckily for us, he came back to life with the piece we're going to hear tonight, the Second Piano Concerto.
Yes.
Absolutely. And this is one of those pieces that everybody knows. It's unbelievably famous. Do you think it deserves its fame?
I think it absolutely does, and we very rarely step back from the brief encounter connection or the romantic wallowing connection to actually consider what it's about. And I think there's one more interesting connection here, which is that Rachmaninov was very influenced by Russian Orthodox or Znameny or sign chant, and based nearly all of his symphonic themes on that idea. So when you listen to dee-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, it actually is a chant. It moves stepwise, because Russian chants weren't supposed like Orthodox, like Gregorian chant. It was supposed to be fairly chaste, so no big leaps. And in the middle of Shostakovich's scherzo, there's a little chant-like theme there too, which is repeated notes, dee 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 da da da. So, if you like, that's the only other connection I can find. And it's also one of the few places where Shostakovich uses chant. He does it later in his later string quartets.
I'm so glad you've said this, because everyone's telling me that these are very Russian-sounding themes. And they're Russian-sounding because of these chants, right?
I suppose so. More religious sounding, because, as I say, Gregorian chant also has that sort of element. But Russian Orthodox, I mean, we know it when we hear it. And if you listen to the middle of that scherzo, in such marked contrast with the crazy film cinema music of Shostakovich, the young silent pianist that goes around it, you think, where's this come from? This is most peculiar, as is most of the symphony. It always takes you by surprise.
And do you like this first symphony? I know it's a great first symphony, but is it a great symphony?
I would say the first two movements are as great and distinctive as anything Shostakovich wrote. You can hear influences, Prokofiev perhaps, a bit of Stravinsky, Petrushka, and that little flute waltz you get in the first movement. Third movement more influenced by Scriabin. Fourth, he actually said, I've written myself out in three movements and I don't quite know what to do. But I have the very genuine feeling that Gianandrea Noseda, with his wonderful sense of impetus, can actually pull that off.
Well, let's hope so. And just a quick plug, you've written a book on Prokofiev.
I've written the first volume of Prokofiev. We've taken him back to the Soviet Union, and the second volume will be entirely about his Soviet years, to try and bring him out into equal status with Shostakovich for the Stalin effect, and how that sort of deepened the music of both composers.
Well, I could talk to you all night, David. When we do Prokofiev, we'll have you back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you. So at this point in our little show, it's time for me to ask a favour. We are very much committed here at the LSO to bringing you these concerts live and free wherever you are around the world, but obviously they do come at a cost. So do consider giving us a donation. There'll be a message on the screen telling you where to donate. I think it's lso.co.uk/donate. And whatever you can give us, large or small, 100% of it will go towards future events like this, and we say a big, big thank you. So the first half of the concert tonight, it's quite a short half, features Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto. If you're tuning in for Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto, we had to change that at the request of tonight's soloist, Seong-Jin Cho. But I'm sure none of us are in any way disappointed at hearing this great piece. So as we've heard, Rachmaninoff wrote this piece. It brought him back from the brink. He'd written his first symphony in 1897, and it was a disaster. A disastrous first performance sent Rachmaninoff into depression, sent him to drink, and it sent him to a very, very down feelings about his own self-esteem. He sought therapy, as any good person would, and he found a doctor called Nikolai Dahl, which did the very unusual therapy of hypnotherapy, and this brought Rachmaninoff back. This piece, the first piece he wrote when he was well again, is dedicated to Nikolai Dahl. And it's in a straightforward three-movement shape. It starts with these tolling chords from the piano, and then we set off with the first of three very, very famous themes. The first one has got a sense of agitation and restlessness about it. The second movement is filled with yearning and romance. That's the famous bit from Brief Encounter that you'll recognise straight away. It's absolutely gorgeous. I have to say, I heard the pianist having a little practice just before we went live, and without the orchestra, it sounded amazing. And then the third movement has got lots of different moods within it. It's playful at times, agitated at others, and then there's another crackingly good theme. You'll hear that theme towards the end played by the entire orchestra. The pianist at this point is a bit of an accompanist, but still very much part of the texture. And then the whole piece ends with Rachmaninoff's little four-note signature, as if he's sort of signing signing the piece off. All of these major themes that you've heard have been plundered and used in many, many songs from Sinatra through to Muse. So there's something in there that you'll recognize, but this is the best way to hear this piano concerto, played live with a great soloist, Seong-Jin Cho, fantastic conductor, Noseda, and of course the wonderful and luscious London Symphony Orchestra. That's all coming up in a few minutes live on YouTube and Medici, and also it'll be live for another 90 days. And I will see you at the interval for more chat. Goodbye.